A very, very warm welcome to you all. It's really nice to be doing something like this at a time like this when, of course, we're all facing such unusual challenges on so many different levels. It's really nice to be talking a little bit about biodynamics. And so as we go through the evening, I just want to say, I'm not going to be making any assumption of prior knowledge. I'm going to really just, the whole purpose here is to give an introduction to craniosacral biodynamics. I want to talk a little bit about the history and the development, and then just unfold some key principles that I think will be interesting. And also, I'd like us at some point, we can do at least one exercise. Maybe we'll even have time for a couple of exercises. And also at a certain point during the evening, I'll pause for question and answers, maybe sometime into the talk, and then also if we've got some time at the end of the talk. There's different ways that you can ask questions. You can write them in the chat box. And also perhaps towards the end, I might invite a few of you just to come online and we can speak directly and have some kind of direct interaction, and look at any interesting topics in that way. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I'm going to show you some pictures, and then let's see now. Oh, no, I'm going to come out here. I want a spotlight. Okay. Great. Good, 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 good. So let's look a little bit at the history and development, and also as I talk a little bit about the history, I'll also unfold a few principles of practice. This work really stems from the insights and the developments that came from an osteopath called Dr. William Sutherland. Dr. Sutherland was a graduate from the first school of osteopathy in the United States. And around the turn of the last century, you could please turn off your sound. We're getting some disturbance coming online. So make sure your sound is off, please. Thank you. That's great. So around the turn of the last century, Dr. Sutherland was in his college laboratory examining a set of disarticulated cranial bones. Esther, could you try and find out whose sound is on? Hopefully we can ask them to turn it off. Great. Sorry about that. Let me start again. I'll start the sentence again. So around the turn of the last century, he was in his college laboratory examining a set of disarticulated cranial bones. These are bones that have been separated. And as he was looking at these bones, he had an insight, a kind of flash of inspiration. He was looking at some of the very specialized sutures, Okay, sorry, we are having some problems with the sound. I hope this is okay. Let me just pause for a moment. Okay. He was looking at some of these very specialized articulations, and he had this flash of inspiration, this flash of insight, that actually these bones were designed for some kind of movement. He was looking at sutures such as this one here. This is the temporal bone, which is at the side of the head. It houses the ear mechanisms. It provides the articulation for the mandible, for the jaw joint, has many interesting functions. And as he was looking at some of these beveled arrangements of the sutures, he basically came to the understanding that these bones, and this is in his words right now, that he thought that these bones are beveled like the gills of a fish, designed for some kind of respiratory movement. So he had this idea coming into his head. These bones are beveled like the gills of a fish, designed for some kind of respiratory movement. He couldn't get this idea out of his head, and he took it back to his college teachers and asked them. And they said, no, don't be ridiculous. You know, the human head in adulthood is fixed. It's not, it doesn't allow for any movement. But he wasn't satisfied with this answer. As he examined, there are over 100 articulations within the head. And as he was examining these joints, he realized that he wasn't satisfied that the answer he was given, that there could be no such thing as cranial movement. So actually he decided to set up an experiment on himself, and he designed a very strange contraption that he put on his head. This is actually a later version of it. It's a helmet that could have leather straps that he could tighten up in various directions. And his reasoning was that if there was such a thing as cranial motion, and if it had any kind of significance, and if we could find a way to prevent this movement from happening, it should be possible to experience some of the effects of this. So he put this helmet on his head, he tightened up the straps in certain directions, and to his surprise, he started to develop a whole range of symptoms that were really not expected. He started not only to get local symptoms such as headaches, but things like tiredness, depression, sleeping difficulties. He would then undo the straps, tighten up the straps in a different direction, and one set of symptoms would go, and another set of symptoms would take their place. So he would start to get things like digestive difficulties or sleeping problems. So things that he just could not explain. He could not just kind of explain away in terms of just compressing the superficial nerves or the superficial blood vessels within the head. So he carried on with this experimentation for actually quite a number of years, even after he graduated as an osteopathic doctor. During this time, he became quite unwell. It was finally his wife who said to him, "For God's sake, William, will you stop this experimentation? You've proven to yourself that there must be such a thing as cranial movement." So this really set him off on a path which he spent the remaining 50 plus years of his life investigating. Dr. Sutherland died in 1954. And really during the whole of the rest of his lifetime, he started to, he was experimenting and digging deeper into what this cranial movement could be. From quite an early stage, he realized that the movement that takes place at the cranial bones is not an isolated movement. From an early stage, he realized that this movement is associated very closely with movement that occurs within other tissues and fluids that are also found at the core of the body. And he identified 5 main aspects to this anatomical and physiological system of relationship. He called it the primary respiratory mechanism, and I'll explain that term primary respiratory a little bit later. But he realized that the bones are really continuous with the membranes that underlie the bones and also that partition the brain. These are the dural membranes. And that any movement that takes place within the bones also takes place within the membranes. He also realized that the central nervous system itself, the brain and the spinal cord, also expresses a subtle rhythmic movement. It has what he described as an inherent motility, and it's part of this motion that he was starting to investigate. He also realized that the fluid that bathes the central nervous system, the cerebrospinal fluid, it's contained within the central nervous system and also on the outside of the central nervous system, that this fluid is also expressing a rhythmic movement. So these 5 phenomena are where Sutherland first started out. But he also understood, actually from quite an early stage, that subtle rhythmic motion is not only a feature of these 5 phenomena, it's actually a feature of the whole body. All living cells and tissues express subtle movements, subtle rhythms. And moreover, he started to understand that the expression of these subtle rhythmic movements has a critical consequence for our health and well-being. That where these movements are able to be expressed without restriction, without impediment, without inertia, essentially all the cells and the tissues of the body are able to express a good state of health. But where there can be places of restriction or holding or stress or trauma held within the body, this is a primary precursor for the development of disease and pathology. So we come really now to one of the fundamental principles of the work, and that is that life is expressed as motion. All life is expressed as motion. If we want to develop let's say, a sure test to determine whether or not an organism is alive or not, it's very, very simple. It's very easy. Let's have a look at it. If it moves, it's alive. If it doesn't move, it's not. But actually, it's not just quite as black and white as this. It's not that we're either alive or we're dead. It's not that we either move or we don't move. Maybe we're alive. Maybe we express this movement, but in some ways it's become compromised. In some ways it's become restricted. And as a result of that, those life-giving forces are unable to fully express through our cells. Now, Dr. Sutherland was experimenting. He realized that he actually developed a very fine sense of palpation, of being able to feel through his hands. And he realized also that you could put your hands, he could put his hands onto his patients and feel for the presence of these subtle movements, and could identify when these movements were not becoming fully expressed. And he was a great student of anatomy. And as he looked at the anatomy, he started to develop a range of skills and techniques to help to restore movement that had in some way become restricted. And when he did that, he found that he was getting incredible results, fantastic results. His patients were starting to recover from conditions that were not responding to other forms of treatment. He developed quite a reputation, and as the doctor who the other doctors in his area would often refer their most difficult patients to, and somehow he was able to get these good results. In the early days of his investigations, Dr. Sutherland's techniques were very, very mechanical. He would use subtle adjustments, manipulations. He would apply forces to the body. As he started to gain more experience and develop his understanding of the work, he realized more and more that it became unnecessary to manipulate the body, to use mechanical pressures in order to make adjustments. That there is actually, we each have a profound ability to self-heal and self-correct. And that if we can create the conditions for this self-healing and correction, then this is something that we can use as a therapeutic principle. Now, also from an early stage, Sutherland considered, what is it that is actually driving these movements? This was quite an early question. And he considered a number of different possibilities. One of his first ideas was, well, maybe this movement in some way starts within the central nervous system. Maybe it begins in the brain, and from there, it then spreads and involves the fluids and the tissues around the central nervous system. There are still a number of theories that are present. It's still a point of debate within our profession. Some people have suggested maybe it's to do with the production and the reabsorption of cerebrospinal fluid, that in some way perhaps this happens in some kind of rhythmic way, and this is what is generating these movements. Other people suggest that maybe these rhythms are a feature of a number of different factors that all harmonize together. Things like venous movement, muscular movement, combined with respiratory, lung respiratory movement, creates other kind of harmonic rhythms. Sutherland considered a lot of different things, but he wanted to get to the, really to the heart of what it was that was driving these motions. And he came to a conclusion that is in many ways very, very simple, but certainly not simplistic. And his conclusion was that it is nothing other than the impulse of life itself that is driving these movements. He used a term from the book of Genesis to describe this. He called it the breath of life, this life force, this life impulse that differentiates us, a living system, from a corpse. And he started to understand that it is essentially these forces of life that are generating these essential movements that take place within the body. Furthermore, he also started to understand that this expression of the life impulse through us carries some kind of basic ordering principle, some kind of pattern for health, that as long as these life-giving impulses are able to play freely through our physiology, then everything can function in a state of balance, in a state of harmony, in a state of well-being. So he started to understand a little bit, why is it that if these subtle movements in some way become compromised, why is it that we develop conditions, symptoms, diseases, pathologies? It's because fundamentally our essential life-giving forces and our essential patterns of health are not able to get fully expressed through our physiology. He developed a very strong reputation during this time to be able to treat a lot of different people with a lot of different conditions. And there is a story I'd like to also relay to you from the history of the work, and which illustrates perhaps how Sutherland came to some of his insights. During the days of prohibition in the United States, this was during the 1920s, Sutherland was on holiday by one of the Great Lakes in America. And he heard a commotion coming from down by the lake shore. And as he went down to investigate, a drowning man had been pulled out from the water. Some of the stories around this say it's because he'd imbibed too much illegal liquor, had gone out for a swim and had consequently drowned. And as Sutherland came to the scene, there were already people there giving this man cardiac resuscitation, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And Sutherland said, well, look, let me try something. I'm a doctor. And he put his hands on the man's head, on the side of the man's head. And he did a technique that he'd been practicing to help to kickstart these subtle rhythmic movements by just applying a little bit of pressure at the sides of the head through the temporal bones. And very quickly, as soon as Sutherland did this, this man essentially coughed, came back, took a breath, coughed up a lungful of water, and made a full recovery. This experience was quite significant for Sutherland because he realized from that time that the movements that he had been working with, the movements that he had been sensing, were somehow more fundamental, more primary than all of the other movements that take place in the body. So of course, we have our cardiovascular rhythm, which is what, 65, 60, 65, 70 beats per minute, a rhythm that is essential for life. We have our lung breathing, on average, maybe, 12 to 18 cycles a minute, something like that on average. Again, an essential rhythm for life. But he started to understand that the rhythms that he was feeling and working with somehow underlies these other movements, these other functions, because even in the absence of a cardiovascular pulse, in the absence of lung breathing, he still felt the presence of this subtle rhythmic movement within this man who had was lying on the shore, who was essentially drowning. So from that time onwards, he started to refer to this system of subtle rhythmic movement as primary respiration. He saw it as more primary than actually all the other functions within the human body, more primary than all of the other rhythms and all of the other functions, that it is essentially a system that underlies everything that we do, or all of our functions, is essentially governed by how this system of primary respiration is functioning. He also, let's consider just also for a moment, what is a rhythm? Okay, so he realized that there are subtle rhythms that play through us, and these subtle rhythms have a fundamental function to play in terms of our physiology. So in a very general sense, a rhythm is a movement that takes place first in one direction and then back. And he realized that throughout the whole body, in a very general way, there is a movement that takes place where essentially the tissues and the fluids move up and outwards. And this is a movement that he termed primary inhalation. And then this would be followed by a movement back, essentially a movement of all the fluids and all of the tissues downwards, and a narrowing side to side in a movement that he called primary exhalation. Now, this is a very big generalization. Within all of this, each bone, each tissue, each organ, each part of the body expresses its primary respiratory motion in particular ways. And for those of you who are going to go on and study this work, you will look at in detail what is normal motion for each bone, each system, each organ. How does it move within this general system of inhalation and exhalation? One of the other things that Sutherland realized also from quite an early stage is that there is not only one rhythm that takes place within the body, there are a number of rhythms. And I'm going to just take a little bit of time right now to unfold let's say a personal view and of this system of rhythmic movement. When Sutherland first started out in his investigations, he identified this rhythm that later became known as the cranial rhythmic impulse. Sometimes some practitioners have referred to this as craniosacral motion. And this essentially is a movement that is expressed at around 8 to 12 cycles a minute. So what it means is that around, on average, 8 to 12 times a minute, there is a movement in one direction and there is a movement back. But as Sutherland went further into his work, he realized that this is not the only rhythm that is present. There are deeper rhythms, there are slower rhythms that are present, that underlie the cranial rhythmic impulse. And in the approach that we call biodynamic craniosacral work, there is much more of an emphasis to work with these deeper, slower rhythms that I'm going to take a little bit of time with you on now. As I talk now about this system of subtle rhythmic motion, I'm going to talk about it a little bit from the inside out, talking a bit about what is it that may be taking place right at the very core, right at the very essence of ourselves, and use that as a starting point rather than, as it were, from the outside in. In craniosacral biodynamics, our understanding is that actually where Sutherland started out, the cranial rhythmic impulse, this is the most superficial, we could say, or the outermost expression of subtle rhythmic motion that we can find and that we can work with. But that there are rhythms within rhythms within rhythms. Okay, great. So maybe actually before I go into this, let me just pause for a moment and see, are there any questions? I don't know if any of you have been writing questions in the chat box, but if there are, I don't know, Esther, are you able to read out any questions that are there? We've been sent a number of questions in advance, so I'm trying to cover a number of these questions that I've already received as I go through the talk. But let's see if there's anything that any of you would like to ask at this stage. You can either do this through the chat box, or if you want, you can come on screen and we can dialogue. Just to let you know, this is being recorded, so if you do come on screen, you might be recorded as well. Great, how are you doing? So far, so good. Any questions? Anything you'd like to check?
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if you can answer it, but I'm just wondering if you know how many different styles of craniosacral therapy there are.
Yes.
Thanks.
So there's a few ways of answering that question, I would say, Katie. There's probably as many different styles of craniosacral as there are practitioners. So there are thousands and thousands, because essentially, I think in practice, what we all do is we embody our particular style and our particular approach. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I would say, there are a number of branches. All of these branches really stem from, first of all, from the work that Dr. Still, the founder of osteopathy, did, and then the work that Dr. Sutherland did as the student of Dr. Still's school. So they all have a kind of common root. But I would say there's maybe half a dozen different branches that have developed over the last, whatever it is, 70, 80 years or so. Some of the branches are more, let's say, mechanically oriented, that rely more on the practitioner making adjustments, doing things to the patient's physiology, which is where Sutherland started out. It's certainly not where Sutherland ended, but many practitioners are still using more of what we would call a biomechanical approach to treatment. And then there is what we call the biodynamic approach, which really relies on the inherent self-correcting forces that get expressed through us, that we use those to make the correction rather than doing things to the patient, rather than using any form of manipulation or directive technique. Okay, but then there are also other branches. In a way, I think every teacher who is out, teaching since however many years develops their own style, their own understanding, and perhaps their own developments. But broadly speaking, I would say, most of the different styles will come under the kind of category of either a biodynamic or a biomechanical approach, or of some kind of mixture of both. But there are other styles as well that people have developed. But thank you. Thanks for the question. Great. Anything else? Anybody else?
Could I ask, is the cranium, is that classified as like one of the 4 diaphragms?
The cranium, how do you mean?
So I know you've got like the diaphragm in the abdomen region, and you've got your lower diaphragm, and then people have talked about how it kind of works like a diaphragm as well in the cranial region.
Yeah, so actually there are many more than 4 diaphragms within the body. Very often in craniosacral work, we talk about 4 major diaphragms, but actually every horizontal arrangement of fascia or tissue is a diaphragm. So the floor of the skull, and sometimes this, what's called there's a ring of Dura, which is at the floor of the skull. This is sometimes considered to be a transverse diaphragm. There's also an arrangement of fascia through the top of the shoulders, just at the base of the neck. It's not a continuous tissue unbroken, but there's a series of tissues that create horizontal arrangements at the top of the lungs. This is also often considered to be a diaphragm called the thoracic inlet. There's the respiratory diaphragm, which you're probably familiar with, and there's also a diaphragm at the pelvic floor, at the base of the pelvis. But it's not just limited to that. Actually, the elbow joint is a diaphragm, the knee joint is a diaphragm. Every horizontal arrangement of tissue, every area like this is a transitionary area that could also be described as a diaphragm. But one of those diaphragms is traditionally described as being present within the floor of the skull. But there is also another diaphragm within the head that partitions the upper and lower portions of the brain. It's part of the dural membrane system called, a part of it called the tentorium. And that also is a horizontal diaphragm, a horizontal arrangement of tissue that is found within the center of the head. So I hope that's okay for you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Great. Good. Maybe take one more now, and then I'll talk a little bit about this system of rhythmic movement that we call the primary respiratory system. Anyone else want to come on? Or any other questions in the chat box? I'll give it a few more seconds, and then if nobody has anything to ask, we'll just move on. Great. Okay. All right. So as I was starting to say earlier, the way I want to talk about this is to actually start at the very core of ourselves, at the very essence of ourselves. Now, for those of you who have experienced cranial work, you will know that the work is, let's say, very meditative. The practitioner will be placing his or her hands on the patient's body. From the outside, it really doesn't look like very much is happening. If you look at a session from the outside, it can be like watching the grass grow. You really don't see very much from the outside. But of course, there's so much that can be happening under the hands of the practitioner. But the practitioner will typically place his or her hands onto a patient's body for many minutes at a time, maybe 10 minutes without moving, maybe 15 minutes, maybe even more, 20 minutes in the same position without moving, essentially sensing and working with these expressions of subtle rhythmic movement that take place within the body. And in this practice, it's not unusual for both patient and practitioner to start to deeply settle. So very often when we first put our hands on somebody, we'll feel all kinds of different movements that are taking place. And then after a little while, a settling will occur. And then perhaps even a deeper settling, and then perhaps even a deeper settling, until both the patient and the practitioner start to experience a state where there is so much settling that there is just a direct experience of profound stillness. Now, in craniosacral biodynamics, there are many, many types of stillness that are being described. There are many levels of stillness. It's a little bit like the Eskimos are said to have 50 words for snow. They have a word for wet snow and dry snow and snow that sticks together. They see so much of it. In the English language, we have one word for snow. We just call it snow. But in our work, we can notice and orient to many, many different nuances, many different styles, many different levels of settling and stillness. So maybe we have 50 words for stillness within the field of biodynamics. The stillness that I'm talking about now is what one of the students of Dr. Becker very beautifully named dynamic stillness. I sometimes refer to this as the big stillness. This is the stillness that underlies everything. This is the stillness that is behind all expressions of life and motion. This is the stillness that is at the core of all expressions of life. It's something in quantum physics that has been identified. It's sometimes referred to as the 0-point field. In many spiritual traditions, it's also explored. Within, for example, within the Buddhist tradition, there is a term to describe this. I don't know, words are very difficult. I don't want to call it a state because it's actually not a state. It's what's prior to all of our states. It's what's before all expressions of life, all manifestations of life. In the Buddhist tradition, there's a Sanskrit word used to describe this. It's called Shunyata. And Shunyata is very often translated as emptiness. But many of the Buddhist teachers who I've spoken with say this is not a particularly good translation, that it's not some kind of just empty nihilistic state. It's actually a state where our full potentiality is found. And also within the Sanskrit, this word shunyata, there is also in the Sanskrit meaning the meaning of luminosity, so that there is some kind of light present, there is some kind of potentiality that is present within the so-called emptiness. Other teachers like to describe this rather as emptiness, as a sense of spaciousness, that everything within it has inherent spaciousness. And this is also certainly true, as has been found within quantum physics, where the basically the space that atoms take up is absolutely minuscule, that we are essentially, according to the quantum physicists, 99.999% space. This computer, this table that my computer is sitting on, it looks pretty solid to me. But if you actually ask a quantum physicist, well, what's really there? The quantum physicist will say, this is mostly space. The solid bits in this table, the solid bits in this computer are a very, very small percentage of what is actually present. Now, I think that when we go very deep within our therapeutic sessions, when we go very deep within our biodynamic sessions, that it can be that both the patient and the practitioner can start to have a direct experience of this fundamental state. Essentially, we can start to reconnect with what is at our very source, what is at our very essence. Now, one of the, let's say, effects of that is that this has a profound influence on our physiological functioning. One thing is for sure, if we truly reconnect with this sense of stillness, this dynamic stillness or inherent spaciousness that is at our essence, that is at our core, one thing for sure is that we never come out in the same way that we went in. Something changes. Our consciousness changes. Our physiology changes. We reconnect to our place of deepest potential. And as a result of that, there is an opportunity for something to heal at a profound level. So we're really now starting to explore, starting to consider what healing may be at its deepest level. One of the practitioners I mentioned earlier, Dr. Becker, who was a student of Sutherland, came up with probably the most radical definition of health that I've ever encountered, and I think it's absolutely sublime. He basically said health is related to an interchange between body physiology and stillness. In other words, when we are able to experientially reconnect to this deep stillness and deep spaciousness that is present within us, as well as all around us, it's present within everything. And when there can be some kind of interchange between all of our actions and all of our expressions of life and the stillness that underlies all of these expressions of life, this has a profound consequence on our health and well-being, and this may well be healing at its deepest level. So this is not unusual in a craniosacral session to experience. It's not something that you can direct. It's not something that you can manipulate, but you can create conditions that can, let's say, more favorably allow for this reconnection to our inherent stillness, our inherent spaciousness. Whether it happens or not, Dr. Becker described it as a sense of grace. When it comes into the room, it comes in as a sense of grace, but it is unmistakable. It's one of those experiences where, let's say, if you are sitting there thinking, oh, am I now in dynamic stillness? For sure you're not. Dr. Becker, he used the image. He said it's the kind of stillness that when it comes into the room, it's the kind of stillness that you can just cut with a knife. It has this sense of immediacy and presence to it, which is absolutely unmistakable. Now, of course, perhaps many of us have been, during those, let's say, those moments of inspiration, maybe those moments of deeper connection that we've experienced this stillness at some point. Maybe it's been walking in nature, maybe it's been on a beach somewhere, maybe it's been on a mountain, maybe it's been when we're doing some form of movement or exercise, maybe it's when we're sitting quietly or even listening to a piece of music. Of course, it can happen. It's what I think many meditative practices are orienting to. But in biodynamics, it's something that we, let's say, we can become aware of. We can also help to create conditions for. Whether it happens or not, we don't know. This depends on the state of the practitioner. It depends on the state of the patient. But this is very much an experience of a unified experience. Words are very difficult because I'm trying to use words here to describe something which is actually underneath words, something which is beyond words. But I hope in some way my words can at least point to the right direction. The experience that the patient has, the experience that the practitioner has, is an experience of unity. It's a non-dualistic state. But essentially, we feel the profound stillness within ourselves, we feel it within our patients, we feel it within the room, we feel it within the environment, we feel it within the whole of the natural world around us. And just being open to that and allowing that stillness to, let's say, allowing us to have some kind of interchange with this profound stillness has hugely powerful consequences. So I've really started right at the, I would say right at the essence, right at the core of who we are and our functioning. And it is from this basic ground state that we can call, doesn't matter what we call it dynamic stillness. It's from this basic ground state that life starts to express itself as motion. And the first motion that is often described by practitioners is a very slow movement that we may sense, which was also given the name by Dr. Becker. Dr. Becker referred to it as the long tide. And I want to just take a little time now just for talking a bit about the long tide and exploring what is the long tide. First of all, it is an extremely subtle motion. Secondly, it is a slow movement. So we can see here in this image that the long tide has a rhythmic expression of 100-second cycles. That means that it takes approximately 50 seconds for one phase of movement to complete. That's almost a minute, 50 seconds, and then 50 seconds back. Okay. So one of the, let's say, the prerequisites for being able to sense the long tide and to work with the long tide is that both the patient and the practitioner, to a large degree, need to slow down. It's not possible to sense or to synchronize to a very slow movement if we're very kind of activated and very, agitated. So the long tide will usually also only really manifest within a therapeutic session when both the patient and the practitioner are able to deeply settle and deeply let go. Then we may start to sense the expression of this very slow movement. Another feature within the long tide is that it's not personal. It's not that I have my long tide and you have your long tide, and maybe I feel my long tide and I can also feel your long tide. That this is a vast field of function that actually extends right the way out into the natural world all around us. We could describe this as a sense of the natural world breathing in and breathing out. And it's not so much that we express the long tide, it's much more a question that the long tide expresses us. We are literally being breathed by this subtle movement that breathes in and out within the natural world. Now, also, when we experience this within a therapeutic session, this is very often when we will see profound changes within the patient, also within the practitioner. We as practitioners, we also get the benefit of this when we start to synchronize to these subtle movements. Essentially, the long tide is a deep and fundamental expression of health. When we start to reconnect with it, and it's not that it's not that it's not there. There's never a time that it's not there. It's always there. But when we start to synchronize with it and reconnect to it, we are essentially synchronizing to a profound expression of fundamental health. It seems, and this is really just a kind of a theory, let's say, but through experience, it seems that the long tide carries within it some kind of blueprint for health. One of the developers of this practice sadly passed away yesterday. His name was Dr. James Jealous. He called this the original matrix of health, an original matrix. It's like a fundamental blueprint or pattern of health that is carried within this subtle expression of rhythmic movement, the long tide. When it is able to play through us it acts as a fundamental ordering principle. It carries within it the, let's say, the knowledge, the blueprint as to how we can reconfigure, how we can reorder, how we can come back into a deeper connection with the essential health that is present both within us as well as all around us. So working with, if it's the right word, synchronizing with the long tide is also a very deep way to work when we're able to reconnect to this subtle movement. We reconnect to an essential blueprint for health. And healing can happen in the most unexpected ways, reordering, reconfiguration. Literally, let's say we get restored to our factory settings. We reconfigure in the way in which we are literally meant to be. So. The long tide is not, as I say, not a personal rhythm. It is a rhythm that is just beyond a kind of a limited sense of self. It is a transpersonal rhythm, one that involves the whole of the natural world around us. But it also, these life-giving rhythms, these life-giving forces also express at an individual level. I am an individual organism. You are an individual organism. Maybe we are all interconnected. Maybe we're all being breathed by the same breath of life, the same life forces, but we are all individual expressions of that. Dr. Sutherland used an interesting analogy. He saw the breath of life as being this hugely kind of universal force that is incredibly powerful. And he used an analogy, it's a bit like when electricity is produced within the power stations, it's produced at so many millions of volts. And then that electricity is stepped down as it's brought into pylons, through pylons into the city. And then it's stepped down. So by the time it comes out of the wall socket, it's what, 240 volts. And we somehow need these forces to be stepped down in order to make use of it. And this was his view, really, of the breath of life, that the breath of life is this extraordinarily powerful force, but in some way it goes through various step downs or transmutations, changes of state, so that we can make use of it, that we can use it for our physiological functioning. Now, in craniosacral biodynamics, these life impulses, these life forces are understood to be expressed within the fluids of the body. This is the same principle, we could say, that's found in many traditional forms of medicine. In Chinese medicine, for example, they talk about qi as being expressed within the fluids of the body, the vital forces expressed within the fluids of the body. And we have a very similar understanding within biodynamics. The fluids are seen as the carriers of this life impulse into the whole, every cell, every tissue, every organ. But of course, fluid is contained within every organ, even bone, which is usually when we examine bone, we examine the dried up bone that bears very little resemblance to living bone. But living bone is full of fluid. It has a blood supply, it has a nerve supply, it has life, it has motion. So every tissue in the body, whether it be bone or liver or or muscle or fascia or whatever, is essentially a fluidic environment. And it's within that fluid that these life-giving forces are being expressed. And when these life-giving forces are expressed physiologically within each individual organism, it generates another rhythm, another rhythmic movement, which is very often referred to these days as the mid-tide. Okay. The mid-tide is essentially an expression of these forces or these potencies that become expressed at a physiological level. And as these potencies become expressed at a physiological level, it generates another kind of rhythmic movement, something which on average has a movement of 2.5 cycles a minute. In other words, around on average 2.5 times a minute, there is a movement in one direction and a movement back. This is often described as like an essential breathing that takes place within all of the cells, within all of the tissues of the body. It's described as an essential motility. This little model that I've got here will perhaps illustrate what this kind of movement looks like. So if you can imagine that this is a cell, or even that this is an organ, maybe this is a bone or a liver, essentially what is happening is that on a very subtle level, it is breathing in, expressing this inherent movement, and breathing out. Something like this, around 2.5 times a minute. And again, this is an essential function. When this is happening, when this is playing through us, all of the cells and the tissues of the body can receive their life-giving forces, can be in connection with this essential blueprint for health. Can become vitalized, can become renewed within each cycle, within each movement of these forces within the body. We literally become vivified, we become recreated, we become restored, we become healed. So this movement essentially maintains our function throughout life. But if in some way this movement has become compromised or affected in some way, this can become a major precursor to the development of disease and pathology. So in craniosacral biodynamics, we do a lot of work here. This is sometimes called the fluid body, the mid-tide. It's a movement essentially of vital forces that get expressed within the body. But actually these vital forces also extend a bit beyond the skin. So this is an expression of the potency that becomes expressed within the whole of this individual. And it is also a field phenomenon. So when we put our hands on a patient and we feel this fluid body, or we feel this mid-tide, it's as if the whole field of the patient, the whole body, all the tissues, all of the fluid within the tissues, but also a little bit of the space around the body, is literally breathing in and breathing out as one unified field of motion. And this is a very profound place also to be able to practice, to be able to do our work. And then we come to the cranial rhythmic impulse, which is where Dr. Sutherland started out. It's not where he ended up, but it's where he started out. And just to use an analogy, perhaps, perhaps we can view the cranial rhythmic impulse a little bit like if you're watching let's say some sailing boats on the surface of the ocean. You will see those boats will be rocking on the surface of the ocean with a relatively fast movement. What is it that will be generating that movement? Well, it'll be perhaps a combination of factors. It's going to be a function of the currents within the ocean, the waves on the surface of the ocean, which way the wind is blowing. There's going to be a whole range of different factors that is going to determine that motion. Well, this is a little bit like the cranial rhythmic impulse. Each bone, each organ is perhaps like a boat on the surface of the ocean, gently getting rocked by a number of different factors, which way the wind is blowing, whatever conditions are present, as well as within the deeper tidal movements that take place within the ocean itself. But as we go under the surface, let's say not so much just looking on the surface of the ocean, as we dive a little deeper into the ocean, we're then much less at the, let's say in the domain of all these faster currents that are on the surface or which way the wind is blowing. We're much more within the domain of the slower, the slower tidal movements that happen within the ocean. And then as we go down even deeper, perhaps towards the ocean floor, then we're also starting to come into even slower movements. Interestingly, the oceanographers have identified at the very depths of all of the deepest oceans of the world, there is a very slow rhythmic movement that takes place. If you want to look this up, you can see articles. It's called the deep sea ocean wave. And interestingly, it also has a movement of 50 seconds in one direction and 50 seconds back. Remember, the long tide is not just us, it's something that is expressed within the whole of the natural world. But as we come down into towards the ocean floor, we may start to notice this slower, deeper movement that is present. And then perhaps at the ocean floor itself, we may start to become aware of the stillness that is present, that underlies this whole system. So that's an introduction to, a summary of what we sometimes refer to as the primary respiratory system. It is a system of rhythms within rhythms, which underneath it all has a deep stillness. I don't believe that this is all of the rhythmic movements that exist in the natural world. I think that what we do in craniosacral biodynamics is that we synchronize to 3 main rhythms that are present, but one of the features of life at every single level of function is rhythmic motion. Rhythmic motion is all around us as well as inside of us. The French Corot telescope is one of the most powerful telescopes ever to be developed. And it's been pointing up towards the stars. And a number of years ago, they discovered that each star has its own rhythmic motion. And they're starting to examine these rhythms, the astronomers, because it's giving them clues as to the properties of these stars. Okay? So from the microcosm, from the, a cellular level, right the way to the macrocosm and to universal phenomena, rhythmic motion is a feature of life. And how we express that rhythmic motion has great significance, great consequences for our state of health. So, how are you doing? Would anybody like to come in with any comment or question, either through the chat, Esther, if there is anything through the chat, or if any of you want to come online? Maybe what we'll do now is we'll do after this, we'll do a little self-palpation. We'll do a little exercise and just see what we feel in ourselves as we start to listen together. But let's take a few moments to see if there's any questions that you'd like to ask.
There's nothing in the chat at the moment, Michael.
Great, thank you, Esther. Anybody have anything you'd like to come on and ask?
I'd like to ask a question, if I may.
Please do, yeah.
I was wondering whether you have any advice for us who want to stay engaged between, well, in the months when there will be no training for the coming months. For example,
Yes.
in terms of reading things, or in terms of even developing skills and presence.
Yeah.
Basically, what is the best way to stay engaged?
This is such a problem. I mean, again, we've had to just keep putting off our trainings. We were due to start our last training in October, and then it got put off to December, and then February, and then April, and now we have to further extend. This is a massive problem right now. If you're part of that training group that is waiting to start, I know we're going to be meeting on Saturday, and I'd love to be able to talk a little bit about this. But there are some things we can do. I'm going to be doing an introductory weekend in London, hopefully in June, that many of you can come to. For those who are able, those of you who are based in the UK, we can take some time to do some work together over a weekend, just to create some foundational skills. But I don't have an easy answer for this. I mean, our activities in terms of the school and the trainings have been put on hold, like I think almost everybody else in our field has. And we're really just having to wait for these conditions to change. Unfortunately, with the nature of the trainings that we offer, it's not something that we can just do online. It's not just something that we can do remotely. We really need to have that classroom experience where tutors can come and work together with students, put our hands on students, work together, learn how to sense things together, and learn how to build and develop those sensory skills and those treatment skills that we need. So I don't have an easy answer. I can give one answer if you want to read something, which sounds like a terrible plug, but it's not meant to, but you can read my book. It's a book called Wisdom in the Body. I am actually just finishing a new 3rd edition. I haven't read it for about 12 years. But I've just reread it, and I've been making lots and lots of changes and lots of updates and adding some sections and lots of clarifications. So the new edition will be out, I would think, sometime in the next couple of months. But the 2nd edition is also good enough. You can read that. So that you should be able to get online if you want to do a bit of background reading. There's a lot of literature to read, but quite honestly, I sympathize. I feel also somewhat frustrated by all of this, but we have to be patient and wait for the right time for us to be able to come together in a classroom and in our groups and be able to develop our skills in that way. So I'm sorry, I just don't have an easy answer for you on that.
Thank you. That's all right. We're all in the same boat.
We are, yes, yes, I do appreciate that. Yeah. So, okay, let me see how we're doing. It's, I've got about 40 minutes left. Okay, that's quite enough time. Let's do a little self-palpation exercise now, I think. So what I'm going to demonstrate first of all, and I'll show you what, and this is just, you know, we'll just see how we get on with this. What I'm going to ask you to do in a minute is to bring your hands ever so lightly onto the top of your head. Now, you may want to, if you've got a table in front of you, it might be easy, like I've got a table now, I can put my elbows here in order to take the strain out and just to ever so lightly touch the tops and sides of my head. If you don't have a table and you're just sitting in an armchair or something, you can just try it like this, but you may find after a little while your shoulders will start to get painful, but you can just relax and move a bit if that's the case. When you do this, I want you to make the lightest of touch, okay? Now, you may sometimes think, the more you know, if you want to feel more, you may think the more you need to dig your hands in. Actually, in this work, it's the opposite that is true. The lighter your contact, the more you're likely to feel. So literally, just let your hands float onto the sides of your head. Hardly touching. You can just go through your hair. You really don't need to be, if you're feeling any kind of pressure on your scalp, you're far too hard. Really just let your hands float. You know, it's like these insects that float on the surface of the water. They're called water boatmen. They skip on the surface. They never break the surface tension. Just allow your hands to really just be ever so light, not breaking the surface tension, and bringing your hands to the sides of your head. And as you do that, just take a couple of minutes maybe to identify something that might be your cardiovascular pulse. So this is your heartbeat. And it's expressed through all of the arteries, even through the little arteries within your fingers, the little arteries within the outside of your head. You might notice this faster rhythm, which is maybe 60, 65, 70, 75 beats a minute. Yeah, this is the rhythm relating to your cardiovascular pulse, okay? And maybe you can just notice that it's not always easy to feel. You can't always get that, but you might sense it in your fingers. And just take a minute just to kind of see if you can find a comfortable position, just to find a little bit of settling, a little bit of slowing down within yourself, and see if you notice this expression of the cardiovascular pulse, and just identify, oh yeah, okay, that's my heartbeat. That's the cardiovascular pulse that I feel right now. And then take maybe a couple of minutes to notice your lung breathing. Now that's usually a little bit easier to feel because as you take a breath in and as you take a breath out, you can usually notice this much more. That lung breath, it may come through your shoulders. It can also get expressed through these muscles that come up into the neck and also behind the head. These are sometimes called the accessory muscles of breathing. So your lung breathing can come up into the head and maybe even palpated within the head. So just take a minute or so to, first of all, listen for your cardiovascular pulse and see if that's there. Not always easy to feel. And then take a minute for your lung breathing and just notice that one should be a little bit easier to sense as that movement maybe gets transmitted through your shoulders, even into your hands, and maybe even directly into your head. And just identify that. Notice I say, okay, that's my lung breathing that I feel right now. And then let's take a few minutes, just in a very open way, without searching for anything, without looking for anything, without needing to feel anything. Just see if you can notice, is there anything else that's going on? Is there any other kind of movement or quality that I might be able to sense that I could not explain away as either cardiovascular pulse or lung breathing? Maybe something slower, maybe something even more subtle, something that underlies those other rhythms. Maybe you notice, for example, a difference in quality from your right hand to your left hand. Maybe, for example, one side of your head feels a little more open or fuller, and the other feels a little tighter or restricted. This is not unusual. So notice if between your two hands, not just for the movements, notice the qualities that you may feel. What's the sensation? What's the quality of the sensation in your hands? Is what I feel in my right hand exactly the same as in my left? Or is there any slightly different sensation or quality? Does it change? It might be that when you first put your hands there, you feel a certain phenomena, and then it develops into something else. You may start, so it's not fixed. You may start to notice different things. Let's just take 1 or 2 minutes right now, just to sit quietly, as best as you can. See if you can just let go of any kind of agenda, any need to feel anything, any looking for anything, and just kind of listen with a sense of openness and availability for whatever you may start to feel in your hands. And it might not be what you expect. It might not be what I'm describing. It may be something completely different. But as you find a way just to slow down and settle with this, what do you notice? Just allowing things to come to you, not looking, not being active, this is quite a passive state. When we develop the skills for craniosacral palpation, it's a very passive listening. It's an availability where we allow things to come to us. If at any stage any of you start to feel uncomfortable, if you start to get a headache, if you start to not be okay with this, just let go of whatever it is we're doing. There's no need to continue, but really just check your sense of ease, check your sense of comfort, that you're not straining in any shape or form. Just allowing things to come to you. We'll just take another minute or so. Great, good. Now, when you're ready to take your hands away, just make sure that you take your hands away really slowly as well. Don't just suddenly snap out of whatever it is you've been exploring. Just let your hands come away real slow. Great, good. Great, how are you doing? Again, you can put things in the chat. If you want to interact, just come online.
We have a few questions in the chat now, Michael.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Esther.
Yeah, a few, okay.
Yes.
So I'm interested in how people who are in trauma respond to the movement.
Okay, great. Well, this is a really huge question. But essentially, what is trauma? It's an experience that we have that essentially overwhelms us. One of the primary responses to a state of overwhelm is to contract, is to freeze. So this is something that when we have our hands on our patients, this is something that we can feel within the expression of these subtle rhythmic movements. It may affect whole regions of the body. It might be a place where there are particular experiences of trauma that are held within particular regions of the body, or it might be the whole system has just gone into some kind of shutdown and freeze response. So does that answer your question? So basically, the practitioner will start to sense regions or even the whole system as being in a state of relative inertia. And then it's about finding ways to allow this to process, which I'll talk about shortly. Great. Let's hear another question, Esther.
Okay, so this one from Claire. Can anyone learn to sense the pulses? Does it take some people longer than others?
Yes and yes is the short answer. Pretty well anyone can learn it. I mean, I've been teaching this work since 32 years or something, 33 years. It's very rare that given the time, given the dedication, that people can't learn the core basic skills. Some people definitely take longer. We have had experience on our trainings where people just couldn't get it. I'm thinking we had somebody on a training, the last person I was thinking was just in a very difficult place within himself. There was a bereavement and he was very depressed. He was on antidepressant drugs. It was a very difficult situation in himself, and he could not find the way to be able to sense and to feel things. He was so much within, still needing to, I would say, process his own experience, his own trauma, his own shock, that it was very difficult for him to be able to sense these things. I think we all have trauma to some degree. We all carry stress to some degree. I think for most of us, it's not an issue. There are ways. It is something that we can learn, or actually, probably to say it even more accurately, it is something that we can unlearn. I think having this kind of very inherent sensitivity and capacity to sense and to feel is a kind of basic quality. It's something which is in our own basic nature. But through stress, through perhaps even through our education system, we lose that inherent ability to sense, and it becomes more difficult. So very often learning these sensory skills and learning these palpatory skills, it's not so much learning more things, it's very often about unlearning or letting go of more things so that we can simply become available. And we take a lot of time with this on our trainings, and we're very used to accompanying people through that journey of essentially letting go and learning how to reconnect to our basic sensory awareness. So
could I just...
Yes, please come. Fernanda, yes.
Hi. Hi. I just wanted to kind of go back to the experience of exercise or something.
Go ahead.
That it was really interesting. I hadn't experienced before, well, I haven't done this before, but that there was almost like it felt very different on each side of my head, almost like that. I mean, just that there was very different, almost like you could kind of move it around or something. I don't know what that means, but a kind of, it was just very fascinating tuning into that.
Thank you, Fernanda. And isn't that interesting? I mean, just, with maybe an hour of explanation or an hour of talk. I mean, I don't know what work you've done before, and maybe 5 minutes of just listening, there's stuff you're starting to feel here. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, it is.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Good. Great. Let's maybe take one more, if there's another question, Esther, or if anyone is online who wants to appear, you're very welcome.
Okay. Can we influence how rhythmic movement is expressed in our being, thus enhancing our capacity for good health? So, for example, meditation, qigong, or is it grace?
Yes, it is all of those things. Absolutely, we can influence, and that's actually the point of the work, is to come back to a more natural expression of all of these rhythmic movements, right from the very core, from the essence, right the way out into the right to the periphery, right to the more superficial rhythms and expressions of life and motion. So absolutely. And this is fundamentally where the healing happens, is because when these rhythms are able to express in fullness and balance, and all in interchange with each other, this is really a state of, we return to a state of health and wholeness. And that is fundamentally where the healing happens, is when we're able to do that. And of course, craniosacral biodynamics is just one route. It's just one way into that. You mentioned qigong, you mentioned meditation, it could be yoga. There are many ways that can help to restore these natural expressions of life and motion and this natural sense of integration. I'm just a great fan of biodynamics. For me, it's I would say the most comprehensive and most elegant way that I've ever found of helping to reestablish and restore these natural expressions of rhythm and motion. But it's by no means the only way. Whatever works for us is good, and is what we can follow. So yes, absolutely. Thank God, I would say, we are not stuck, just with where we are right now. If we could never change anything, life would be static. We'd be stuck. We'd never be able to heal. We'd never be able to move from anything. But thank goodness, we still carry the potentiality for health. And at a fundamental level, these expressions of health are still present and still always available. If we can reconnect to them, if we can synchronize with them, we always have that potential for change. Thank you. Great. Okay, well, we've got about 15 more minutes or so. I think I'm just going to show you a few more slides. This is a quote from Dr. Stephen Hawking. I think you'll be familiar with him, one of the great physicists of our time. He passed away, I think it must have been about 9 or 10 years ago now, something like that. But this was a book that he wrote, I think, about 20 years ago. And one of the main premises from the book was that he said the universe, in short, was spontaneously created out of nothing. Thus, all of us can trace our ancestry back to nothing. So essentially what he's saying is that spaciousness, emptiness, nothingness is at the heart of everything. And if we want to go back to the source of ourselves, that is what is at the source. I'm going to flick on here. This is an image of what is sometimes described as the three bodies. And each of the three rhythms that I've described to you is expressed within a certain field of function. So here we have the physical body, which is what's underneath the skin. This is very much the domain of the cranial rhythmic impulse, the faster rhythm. It really takes place within the organs and the tissues and the fluids within the physical body. Then we have the fluid, what is sometimes described as the fluid body. It includes the physical body, but it also includes the field immediately around the physical body. It's something that Dr. Becker referred to as the biosphere, our biosphere. This is our whole field of function. And this essentially is the domain of the mid-tide. It is a field phenomenon that encompasses the tissues of the body, the fluids of the body, but also the vital forces, the potency that is expressed within the body, but also extends beyond the skin. And then we have these wider fields of function. This is the domain of the long tide, sometimes referred to as the tidal body, which really extends as a much wider field of function that goes right the way out towards the horizons on all sides. One of the things that we also look at a lot in biodynamics is embryology, and I'm just going to touch on this now, because essentially it is thought that the same vital forces that are primarily responsible for our embryological development are the same forces that maintain us and heal us throughout life. This has been a question for embryologists over many years. You know, what is it that is primarily responsible for our embryological development? And these days, a huge amount of emphasis is placed on looking for genetic mechanisms that are that can explain our embryological development, our cellular differentiation, and our formation of all of the body systems. The fact of the matter is there has never been any genetic mechanisms proven that have been proven to be primarily responsible for the shaping and the primary organization of the human body. It's not that genetics don't have an important influence, they do. Genetics will determine whether we have brown skin or white skin or black skin or yellow hair or black hair, or red or blue eyes or brown eyes. So genetics will shape us in that way, but genetics don't necessarily determine whether we have skin or whether we have eyes. This is something else. And one of the great pioneering embryologists, who was actually a contemporary of Dr. Sutherland, but certainly as far as I know, they never had any interaction. His name was Dr. Blechschmidt. He came to the conclusion through examining thousands and thousands of embryos that there must be some kind of force that is operating within the fluids of the embryo that is primarily responsible for our embryological development and unfolding. And this is actually exactly the same conclusion that Dr. Sutherland came to when he was considering the breath of life as an organizing force, as the potencies, the forces of the breath of life that get expressed within the fluids of the body. This was the same conclusion that he had. So when we essentially work with these expressions of primary respiration, we are essentially working with the same forces that created us in the first place, that also maintain us throughout life, and that also heal us. In other words, embryology is not just something that happened, however old we are, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. Embryology is constantly happening. We are constantly becoming revitalized. We are constantly becoming recreated. And this is what is fundamentally healing us. And this is what we can start to synchronize with when we start to sense and work with these subtle rhythms within the primary respiratory system. So within our courses, we also look at embryology, we look at the movements that happen within our embryological development, because these are the self-same movements that happen throughout life as expressions of primary respiratory motion. Okay. But then, of course, we become conditioned. We become shaped by the experiences of life, even from an early stage, even at a stage of being a single cell is responsive to our environment. And again, as I mentioned before, if there's great stress or trauma, the primal response is to contract. Now, normally, if our forces of health are sufficiently robust, if the experiences that we have are not too repetitive or overwhelming, we're able to process and dissipate any stressful or traumatic experiences and come back to that basic health that was there, if you like, as our birthright. But sometimes we're not able to do that. We don't have the resources to do that. And so we retain the imprints of experiences that we're unable to resolve. And this is what we can feel when we put our hands on each other. We start to take shape according to our experiences, whether it be our family, our education, our background. We adopt the shapes that we learn very early in life, and we will often carry these shapes as we go right the way through our lives, unless we find some other way to help us resolve these imprints, these patterns that can become locked within our physiologies. So basically, what happens with unresolved experiences is that they can be, or unresolved stressful or traumatic experiences, they can be like stones on a sandy beach. As the waves come in, the movement happens all around these places, but this is like a place of relative hardness, of relative stuckness. So it becomes a fulcrum around which we have to function physiologically. But here in this place of contraction, in this place of condensation, of compression, the vital forces of the breath of life and the blueprint that it carries is no longer able to fully express. And so this can be the precursor to the development of disease and pathology. We can start to, we develop what are called inertial fulcrums of inertia, places within the body that are not able to express our natural motion. One of the principles of biodynamic practice is one of the fundamental principles of osteopathy. And this is my favorite quote from the founder of osteopathy, perhaps somewhat appropriately called Dr. Still. He said, the object of the physician is to find health. Anyone can find disease. Now, what that means is that in our approach, we're not looking to push away the places of inertia. We're not looking to get rid of them. What we're looking is to find the health and to support the expression of health in places where it's not able to express as fully as it can. And all of the rhythms of the primary respiratory system are essentially expressions of health. So when we are able to facilitate conditions for these rhythms to come back into play, we are literally facilitating the health. We synchronize to these rhythmic movements. We can support their expression in places of inertia and conditioning, and find a way to allow this health to express again. We do this with our hands. Our hands are perhaps the most sensitive instruments that have ever been